Good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll make a start. I think there might be one or two coming in. Hello. So my name is Will Crook, and I'm the Head of Policy and Communications at PLS. Welcome to what has nicely become, thanks to Rishi Sunak, a highly topical policy panel, taking place, of course, on polling day. And just as a public service reminder, those eligible still have until 10 p.m. To vote, so do make sure you use yours. As some of you may still not have voted, I will be a little bit careful with what I will say on this panel, and you'll all be pleased to know that I've removed all the jokes I'd written about the 4th of July and removing unpopular Westminster-based regimes. So that's that other thing. Anyway, being on polling day means that this year carries on a fine tradition for the PLS policy panel. As in 2002, the policy panel that I chaired faced a race against the existence of the Boris Johnson administration, as on the day of the panel, there had been a steady flow of ministers resigning. So as I was chairing the panel, I was in this slightly surreal position of having to check my phone to see whether the government still existed by the end of the panel and whether what we said actually was still true. Luckily for us, depending on how you look at it, Boris, of course, stayed on for another 24 hours. Will the same be said for Rishi? We shall see. Anyway, but we're not here to talk about potential results. We're here to focus on what this election could possibly mean for copyright in the UK, and to share some expert insights with you all. I have three wonderful colleagues who are usually very busy representing the interests of publishers, authors, and the creative industries in the corridors of Westminster. They are Caroline Commins, the Director of Policy and Public Affairs at the Publishers Association; Luke Alcott, Public Affairs and Policy Manager at the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society, or ALCS, as you probably know them as. And some of you may be wondering why Ailey Wilson from the PPA is not with us today. I'm afraid to say, sadly, Ailey was a little unwell and couldn't make it. We, of course, send Ailey our best wishes and hope she gets better soon. I'm very happy, however, and actually extremely relieved to tell you all that we are joined today by Stephanie Reeves, the new Director of Policy and Public Affairs at the British Copyright Council, who has stepped in for Ailey at the last minute. Now, Stephanie has only recently joined the BCC, taking over from Saskia, who sat on this panel last year, as some of you may remember. But I should add that being new to the BCC doesn't mean that Stephanie has any less experience in Westminster. She has worked in policy and public affairs for over 16 years, joining the BCC from Hawthorne Advisors, where she'd been a senior director. And before that, she was Director of Government Affairs for Red Bull for 6 years. So, Stephanie, welcome to the world of copyright. I know that you've been busy meeting members of the British Copyright Council. Of course, the Publishers Association, ALCS, and ourselves are all members. How has your start been?
Well, it's been dominated by the election, I think is the best way of saying it. I think I had 2 days before Rishi called his surprise election. So that, I think, had radically changed how I thought my first few days would go. But obviously, it's a brilliant time to get on board. And I know we're going to touch on the sort of impact of what does that mean and what comes next in this panel. But it's been a brilliant introduction. I'm very grateful to everyone who's helped with my onboarding.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. So we will start first with you, Caroline, if I may, and maybe take a look back at the what has preceded the election. And I think it's fair to say, certainly in my time at PLS over the last 2 years, most, if not all, the discussion on copyright in Westminster has been related to AI in some way. Now, over the last Parliament, we've had the government, or the previous government, try to introduce a new copyright exception for text and data mining, and attempt to create a voluntary code of practice for the use of copyright-protected material in generative AI. Perhaps you could tell everybody what the government were trying to do in those instances, and why both of them failed.
Thanks, Will, and hi, everyone. It's really good to be here this afternoon. I wanted to thank Will, actually, firstly, for sparing us all a question on a prediction for tomorrow's result.
That comes later, sorry, Caroline.
As a government affairs professional, the elections over the last 14 years have made us very, very nervous about predictions. So thank you for kicking off with AI instead. That has been a huge focus for us at the Publishers Association, and I know at many publishers and other rights holder groups in the last 2 years, as Will touched on, the what is still the current government brought together a firstly they proposed a exception for AI to use rights holders' work, sort of in line with the EU one, but taking it a step further, unlike the EU exception, which allows for just for research. This would cover basically all of copyright holders' work. So we were really concerned about that, and along with rights holders across the whole creative economy, campaigned against it. And we were really, really glad when that proposed copyright exception was dropped. The government then committed, I know a lot of you already know this, kind of part of those discussions, they then committed to pulling together rights holders and AI developers to develop a voluntary code of conduct for the use of intellectual property in AI training. That failed. I mean, that process ran for about 9 months. We were part of it. I know a lot of other rights holder groups were as well, and absolutely went to the table in good faith. But fundamentally, the process failed. And I think a big reason for that is that the AI developers couldn't come to the table in good faith, because a lot of them have used rights holders and creators' work without permission, without attribution, and without any payment. And so it's not possible for them to commit to a voluntary code of conduct because they've already infringed copyright, used rights holders' work, and so weren't in a position to compromise. And indeed, a number of those AI developers around the table actually were involved and continue to be in litigation around the copyright infringement that they've undertaken. So as I say, I think rights holder groups went to that conversation in good faith, but it was perhaps doomed from the start. And we feel very strongly at the Publishers Association, and I know other creator and rights holder groups also feel this, that actually we'll need to see from government, so from tomorrow from the new government, much more proactive work by the government, probably legislation as well, on areas, for instance, such as transparency about what work has been used in training, rather than relying on the goodwill of AI developers who we know have already scraped and consumed work without permission.
Excellent. Yeah, and it was quite interesting in the current or previous administration, what time ever we're on. I mean, they made a lot of changes. Obviously, the Intellectual Property Office, who were running the code of practice talks, they were put within the Department for Science, Innovation, Technology, a new department, and they were under the newly created the AI IP Minister. Do you think the creation of that minister has been positive, or have those two competing sides, perhaps, for want of a better phrase, it's been impossible to kind of make any progress?
I think that role in itself doesn't need to be a problem, but I think there was an issue in that the holder of the role probably didn't have enough authority from wider government to really drive forward the change that was actually needed. I think when that process fell apart, you then had Secretaries of State in DCMS and DCIT sort of sitting up, taking notice. We also know that Number 10 started to take notice at that point and were more interested in engaging at sort of Secretary of State and Number 10 level. So the minister, I mean, where responsibilities sit within government is sort of a moot point. They can move around between different ministers, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. I think what you need is from the very top of government investment in tackling some of these big issues. And I don't think we had that, frankly, until the IPO process failed.
No, true. And during that last Parliament, it's fair to say we had some various kind of very supportive reports from the House of Lords and backbench committees as well. How influential were those committee reports on what was being debated in Westminster?
Yes, some really, really great committee reports, both across the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The Publishers Association was involved in those, giving evidence, as were many other rights holder groups. And in all of those reports, we saw parliamentarians coming out strongly in favour of rights holders being able to uphold their rights, creators' rights, there being greater transparency. And I think that made a really important contribution to the conversation. I'll probably pull out in particular the House of Lords Communications Committee. They did 2 reports, actually. Firstly, broadly on new technologies and AI and what that meant for creativity, and then the next one specifically on large language models and the issues around copyright. And having that kind of expertise that the House of Lords, the peers on that committee brought to the issue was really valuable. And their final report, was pretty scathing of the government. I think he said, sitting on its hands while rights holders and creators saw their work being infringed. That kind of thing from an influential parliamentary committee does make the government sit up and take notice. So kind of, I suppose a positive thing while we have all this change of government is we'll know there'll be still some stakeholders within the Lords who really know their stuff on copyright, who really have creators and rights holders' interests at heart, who will still be there tomorrow and continue to fight those fights alongside all the work we'll do to get the new House of Commons on board as well.
Yeah, I think we'll touch upon that later, I think, Caroline. But yeah, excellent. And, that's kind of where we were leading up to the election. Obviously, I'm not sure many people kind of had predicted that the election would take place in July. But on the lead up to polling day, what has been the approach and the reaction from the major political parties to the messaging that obviously the Publishers Association, obviously ALCS, etc., have been sending them and engaging with them on matters of copyright? And were you pleased, happy, concerned about how copyright was mentioned in manifestos?
So manifestos are a very interesting beast, I would say, because you really hope to see all of your interests in there, and the potential future government really laying out very, very clearly everything they're going to do. I think partly because of how high-level manifestos can be, and also for Labour as a result of the kind of an election coming sooner than they were expecting, some of that policy detail just isn't there. So there's not a huge amount of detail. The Labour manifesto doesn't actually mention copyright specifically at all. That said, we at the Publishers Association, I know other groups as well, have had some really positive conversations with the Labour culture team in particular, and we were really pleased to see in the Labour creative sector plan a real recognition of the value of the creative industries, and actually it specifically says that they will make sure that intellectual property is upheld. So while the Labour manifesto doesn't go into much detail on that, it does say that Labour intends to implement the sector plan, and the sector plan is pretty good on copyright. Again, because of the election coming sooner than Labour expected, I think some of the policy detail isn't worked out. So a huge priority for us and for lots of other groups will be to make sure in the coming months, where you've got new ministers in place, that the detail around what does upholding copyright actually mean is worked through with support from publishers and other groups.
Excellent. And Luke, just to kind of maybe ask from the ALCS author perspective on the manifestos that were published by the major parties. Again, I kind of asked you the same question pretty much. Was it pleasing? Was there anything of concern? Would you want copyright mentioned a bit more? What was your take on that?
So in terms of the manifestos, and likewise, we understand that there's a lot of reasons that copyright and authors wouldn't necessarily be front and centre in manifestos, especially in this campaign. We did think that on paper, Labour's manifesto was perhaps the weakest on copyright and authors. But then since then, we have seen Chris Bryant speaking very positively about things like protecting the importance of human creativity, I think was the phrase he used. So we feel quite positive about that, taking that and going forward with that. At the same time, I would definitely say we had to, we were very, very welcoming of the Lib Dem manifesto, which was specifically positive on copyright and licensing. I'm not sure if that's because in this election they're able to focus more on other issues. You know, Labour is more shackled to the fact that it's going to have to implement its manifesto, and that's why they could be very top level and low on detail. But also the Lib Dems have consistently had a really engaged team of Lords, especially, working with the creative industries and really getting involved on the details of copyright and licensing. In fact, we were quite surprised to see the word, copyright and licensing in the same sentence in a manifesto, but it was a nice surprise.
Yeah, I think it was, the prediction was that copyright wouldn't be mentioned too much in these manifestos. So it was actually pleasing to see it included in manifestos, and I agree the Lib Dems have certainly have been good on this issue. It was the debates, the backbench debate that was called on the exception that was proposed. Sarah Olney, the Lib Dem MP, was one who had tabled that. So excellent. So that's kind of where we are roughly at the moment. Let's take a look at what may or may not happen in the future with that huge asterisk for whatever's going to come next. Stephanie, how do you think this election will affect those ongoing discussions about copyright and AI? Will it mean that we're back where we started, or is there some momentum, you think, towards a resolution? What do you think the challenges will be of this new parliament and perhaps a new party in government?
Yeah, lovely. I think after all the good work that has obviously been going on and some of the momentum that had obviously built up with the House of Lords and other interesting kind of groups thinking in this space, I think the general election has given us a bit of a pause, perhaps. We've lost a little bit there, and that purely is because Parliament doesn't exist anymore. There's no MPs, they're back campaigning, and that does mean that some of the good debate and the steps that had been taken forward just inevitably pause. Clearly, that is not going to be the case from tomorrow. So we've had a sort of brief interlude where, as much as there's been lots of interesting things going on behind the scenes, there's been some ICO consultations, there's been the launch of a new machine learning group with the IPO, lots of interesting things there, but not the sort of legislative arm and the interesting policy debate that we had probably seen the best of we've had in the last, say, 6 months or so. We've really, I think, seen that leap forward a bit. I think whilst everyone will return with great gusto with whatever the outcome is, I think we were just sort of discussing what Parliament looks like today, and people will have new offices, they won't have their phone lines set up, they don't get their parliamentary emails for a few days. If the outcome is as we imagine, we will have an entirely new set of ministers with such a large intervening period between changes of government. Is the vast majority of them have absolutely no experience of running a government department. They've never run a private office. And so the practicalities of getting up to speed and picking up the baton is a huge challenge. And there are some really boring sort of parliamentary points, which is that parliamentary recess looms large. So they really only get a couple of weeks to get up to speed before Parliament sort of shuts down again. So that's the sort of slightly less positive-y side. I think the real win is that we've got some really good markers in the sand. Huge progress has been made in the last 18 months, I think, in particular, and all of that remains, all of that is on parliamentary record. I think the parliamentarians who will remain, some of which, as we say, have had mixed and quite muddled, but nevertheless a really good introduction to this, may well stay. So we've got some MPs as well as our peers who will be ahead of the game, and I think that's very valuable. I think crucially, I think it was 2 days before the election was called, Chris Bryant said, we're going to have an AI bill. So the rumours that this comes in the King's speech in the next few days are, we'll find out, I guess, and we can only really speculate. But I think that means that change is afoot, that there is momentum behind this in the new Parliament, whatever that might look like. And I think what we have here for the first time, I think, is a real commitment to legislate. I think that's on the record. It's in Hansard. So we're definitely not at point number one we are several steps down the road to really making some progress, and I think that is. I think that's a real success and a testament to colleagues here who have obviously, I'm still new, but these guys have been working on this for a very long time. So
that's very kind, Stephanie. I mean, I've got the question kind of leads nicely after that. You said about the AI bill, and that it's likely to be in the King's Speech. I mean, obviously the last government didn't legislate for AI or introduce much, if any regulation. What kind of regulation should we be asking for, will we be asking for in this next Parliament? What will the creative industries be asking from the next government in terms of AI?
So it's going to be very broad from obviously our membership we cover all writers and authors and performers and all sorts of creators. So there will be a good number of mixes, and I defer to my colleagues on specifics, but we've touched on it repeatedly throughout the course of the conference today, and I think it is transparency. We can't really ask for specifics until we know what and where and when material and content is being scraped, and as we know now, most of it's already been taken, and we need to make sure that we can bring the relevant people to the table to negotiate the outcomes of any AI bill, and I think we're going to need some brilliant negotiators. I think one of the things that I know that we will all collectively agree on is also that we need international alignment on this. Obviously, the EU AI Act will be very crucial. None of this really can act in a silo, so making sure that we're talking to our international colleagues as well, I think, will be very crucial. I don't know if I pass the baton down the line to anyone.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think if rights holders and creators don't even know that their work has been used, like, we don't have a fighting chance of defending that or stopping that. So I think transparency will be key. We actually talk to our partners in Europe a lot, because in the AI Act that the EU brought in, there is a transparency requirement within that, which is actually now being implemented in the EU. So that's a really interesting conversation, because there's a question basically of what does transparency actually mean, like how much detail as a rights holder do you need in order to be able to enforce your rights. So kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of that is vital for it to actually translate into legislation.
Yeah. And definitions, forgive me, definitions I think is going to be a really crucial one. We're very familiar with things like LLMs and machine learning and things like that, but obviously a crucial part of designing legislation will be working out what machine learning actually means. And as we all know, it will probably take 2 years to put legislation through, and the machines will have evolved so far beyond that it does become a very complicated task ahead of us, but also a very exciting and interesting one to grapple with.
Yeah, and I'd just say on that point, it's a really important point about legislating for modern technology, that you have to be principles-led,
yes,
not technology-led.
Yep.
And it's been really interesting seeing the passage of the Digital Markets Bill, which is now an act, which the government introduced to sort of tackle the dominance of big tech, which is great news. We really support it. We're delighted it's become an act. But within that, we and other groups really push that you're talking about the principles of how dominant tech firms are, not the technology itself, because legislation takes a long time. Technology evolves very quickly. So I'm really keen with the new government that we talk about the principles of copyright and how we uphold those principles in the face of technological innovation, rather than, you could legislate for large language models today, but in a year the technology has moved on. The principle that rights holders and creators should be fairly remunerated is eternal.
Excellent. And to finish off slightly, I'd like to discuss what our respective industries are asking from the next government, whoever they may be, and what you will be campaigning on for the foreseeable future. I'd like to ask you, Luke, first. From the author perspective, what are the priorities for ALCS in the next Parliament? What are your asks from the next government in terms of copyright and other matters? And have the parties been receptive to what you've been asking?
So I'll start off by saying one of our biggest asks has obviously been on AI. And I would echo the point that is looking at a principles-based approach on transparency. That is the only way that you get help authors have remuneration for their use of their work and control over how their work is used, but also potentially on the trickier issue of how AI outputs are labelled, because that's what's going to be flooding the markets and competing with authors' works. But beyond AI, we'd be very interested to see the government backing a range of measures that would work within existing copyright to help bring remuneration for authors. So that includes things like what we're calling a smart fund, which we're working with other collective management organizations in the creative industries on, which would be an equivalent to private copying, which is a method of remuneration you have across Europe. And research that we've funded has found that this could be worth about £250 million to create in the United Kingdom. It could be very helpful. And we're also asking for the government to take a look at news scraping of journalist work, because the platform economy, the way that people work with, or the way that people consume content through digital platforms, means that there's a big value gap being created for journalists as well as press publishers. We're also asking for some more support for the author share program, which we've launched, which helps authors get paid for sales of second-hand books, which is very much a voluntary scheme for large sellers, not targeted at the small kind of charity bookshops. And we are calling for a freelancer commissioner to be established, because we've found over recent years that the government is not very good necessarily at identifying the impact of its work on freelance workers. And we hope that, especially with the Labour government, it could be a very positive way for them to address a range of kind of detailed issues that freelance workers face. In terms of the feedback that we've had, we've discussed AI a lot, and it's looking like it could be positive for the next government. Especially the civil servants have worked very hard on getting to grips on the details of the issues. We've also had quite broad support for the other issues, because the Smart Fund is quite a positive way of making sure that a lot of creators get more money without impacting the government's budget at all. So they're very keen, or they were very keen, to look at a kind of nice legacy point like that. And I think there is a very clear understanding from the incoming government that there's an issue on news scraping that needs to be dealt with. And the freelancer commissioner is something that we've generally had quite good support for. And actually, I think at the most recent creative hustings, the Lib Dems actually voiced their support for it, which we really welcomed.
And Caroline, you as a PA have obviously done quite a lot with their Ask too. Do you want to give a quick summary of what you've asked from the next?
Absolutely. Well, I think firstly we want to work hand in hand with the wider book sector, so with authors, with booksellers as well, to make sure that the health of our whole sector flourishes. In terms of what the PA specifically spoken about, we put out a vision for publishing at the start of the year, which outlines all the policy asks we've been discussing with government during this election campaign, and will push with the new government. So I'll just touch on a few. One is that we know that while literacy rates are rising, which is fantastic, that children reading for pleasure is in decline, which is a massive shame. As someone who's loved reading, it just feels really sad, but also for children, for the state of our nation, we know that reading for pleasure is the single biggest indicator of a child's future life chances. So there are huge benefits to getting children reading. So as publishers, we really want to work with the new government, with authors, with booksellers, to make sure that all children have access to books and the time to read. So that includes, having time in school dedicated to reading. It means ensuring that every primary school has a library. At present, 1 in 7 primary schools doesn't have a library. So we'd like to do some work with the new government on that. We think that's win-win. I think you'll get a happier, healthier, more educated society if we get kids reading. Obviously, we, as well as our consumer and education publishers, we also represent academic publishers who play an incredible role in pioneering and showcasing the UK's world-leading research. It was great to see actually in Labour's manifesto some recognition of research, and we'd like the role that academic publishers can play in showcasing that to the world, in driving forward innovation. We'd like to see that recognised, and us to work with in partnership with government on that. And then finally, a thing that I'm going to love telling all our new MPs is the UK exports more books than any other country, which is just extraordinary. We are truly world leading in that regard. So we would love to talk to the new government more about trade and how we support trade, so we can maintain and kind of grow that world leading position.
Excellent.